15 years ago, there was a show called Avatar: The Last Airbender. A story about a young boy, or a 112-year-old man, depending on how you measure it, whose destiny is to reunite the warring kingdoms and bring balance and peace back to the world. And after 3 long seasons of joy and strife, of love and betrayal, of struggle and redemption, our young hero finally fulfills his destiny, defeating the big bad using the wonderful help of a Deus Ex Machina turtle, and ending the war. A happy, happy ending. But while the fictional war was over, in real life another war had been brewing and would rage on years after the last episode aired. These were the shipping wars. This video is going to contain spoilers, so if you live under a rock and you haven't watched or finished the show, and you want to be surprised about the twists and turns, romantic or otherwise, then you should probably click away now. Alright, so, full disclosure here. I first watched this show when I was like 13, 14, and I remember at the time, I did ship Kataang, how do I say this? Let's say I rooted for Zutara and Kataang to get together, but to be honest, I don't think I would call myself a shipper. Or especially like looking back now, I don't think I was a shipper then, because I wasn't really rooting for them for any particular reason other than like what else was there to root for. I didn't see any alternative pairings to ship. I never once questioned Kataang, like I never thought about justifying to myself or whatever, why Zutara and Kataang would work as a couple, let alone work better than any other couples. And because I was like a year late to the show when I started watching it, I think I might have been like not even all the way through season 1 before I first heard of Zutara as a thing. And when I first heard about it, I was just like, wait, what? Like, what the hell? Like, he's the enemy, right? How does this make any sense? This is like shipping Nala with Scar or something. Like, what? Seeing it from an older perspective, I don't know how I missed all of the early hints of Zuko's redemption arc. When Zuko went on his soul-searching journey in season 2, I legit did not see that coming. I didn't see any of this coming. Yeah, I'm telling you, I was pretty dense. But it was about this time, like about midway through season 2, and definitely by the end of season 2, we all know what episode I'm talking about. But it was definitely around then that I did start to entertain the idea of Zuko and Zutara as a couple, like what that would mean for the themes of the story, for the character arcs and development. And honestly, yeah, it grew on me. By the time I was like midway through season 3, I was a pretty hardcore shipper. Now, I could make like an hour-long video about why I think Zuko and Zutara are more compatible for each other than Zutara and Kataang. And we could argue until the cows come home about like how much weight does this or that scene have in terms of like shipping fodder. For this video, I'm going to try and focus on something else, something hopefully a little less provocative. And that is, what exactly is it that draws each shipping fandom to their preferred ship? At the end of the video, I will segue into like, could we have gotten a satisfying conclusion for our non-canonical ship, Zutara? And if yes, what that might have looked like. But for now, I just want to talk about why I think each ship manages to be so appealing to their respective fan bases, why this hold is so strong, and maybe give us a better understanding of why people get so worked up about it on the internet. So I had 2 main ideas that I wanted to test. I suspected that Kataangers would be more likely than Zutarians to prefer like canonical ships for obvious reasons, and I wanted to test that. But I also wanted to test like, to what extent does your ship correlate to the kind of views you might hold about romance in fiction? And about that, I have some interesting results to show you because, yes, I did a survey and the results are in. Probably not a surprise to anyone here, but a lot of Kataangers do ship Kataang simply because it is canon. Or at least, let me put it like this, they wouldn't have shipped it if it wasn't canon. The survey is still open and you're welcome to go through it if you like. I'll put the link in the description down below. But if we just look at the answers I've got so far, it's quite telling. Kataangers were a lot more likely than Zutarians to consider canonicity as like an essential requirement for favouring a ship, which makes sense given that Kataang is canonical and Zutara isn't. I also joined an Avatar Discord channel just to like start this discussion, and the answers I got gave me further confirmation of this theory. Now, I tried to test this theory further by asking Kataangers like how loyal they would have been to their ship if there were never any explicitly romantic scenes depicted between these two characters. And you can see that spread here. And then I tried asking Zutarians how loyal they would have been if Kataang had been played up a lot more in the show. And you can see the two charts side by side here. Firstly, I know these two questions aren't exactly equivalent, and part of the problem was I couldn't really ask Zutarians the same question that I wanted to ask Kataangers for pretty obvious reasons. And before you pounce on me, Zutarians, please understand I'm on your ship.
Stop blowing holes in my ship!
So just let me finish. Anyway, the spread of answers I got weren't as different as I was expecting them to be. Like, I was hoping to see whether manipulating canonicity would influence one fandom more than the other. And like, there's maybe a little bit of that, but it's not pronounced enough for me to make any definitive statements, I think. I don't know. It might also be hard to like try and imagine a show that you didn't watch and try to accurately report how you would have responded to it. Regardless, I definitely think that this chart clearly lends weight to the idea that canonicity is a lot more important to Kataangers than Zutarians. Like, a good half of them clearly don't give a shit. Now, the fact that Katara and Aang are confirmed canon and have more overtly romantic scenes in the show, obviously that's not the only criterion that draws Kataangers to their ship, and Zutarians clearly operate under a different metric altogether. So if you ever wondered why you occasionally get these bizarre flame wars that just boil down to like, well, our side won, get over it, to, but our side's better, so eat shit. Well, now you know. But that being said, this alone doesn't cover everybody. Clearly, the majority of shippers from both sides would still ship their pairing, even if it wasn't as legitimized by canonicity. Basically, for many shippers, particularly the ones that couldn't really care less about canonicity in the first place, which pairing you ultimately ship has more to do with what kind of romance appeals to you most. Have you ever wondered why, even today, despite never being legitimized as canon, Zutara still enjoys like a hefty amount of support among the fan base? I mean, there are a lot of non-shippers or like casual viewers who never really cared about the romantic subplots. You know, like they never bothered to worry about who would end up with who, and they would have been happy with either or even neither option. But among the zealous shipping fan base, Zutara remains like a pretty healthy contender to Kataang even after 15 years. And depending on like the polling site or the way you measure it, it sometimes even wins that popularity contest by quite a margin. For example, if you want to define popularity as in which pairing has the highest fan engagement, well, comparing the amount of fan work created for both ships on sites like DeviantArt or fanfiction, you get far fewer results searching Kataang than searching Zutara. And if that doesn't convince you, it's also literally the poster child for the TV tropes page of fan-preferred couples. All very fascinating, but why? Why does that popularity exist? And why has it endured for so long? To answer this question, let's actually explore and compare the relationship dynamics of these two pairings. I think it's fairly easy to demonstrate that Kataang leans more to like the kind of romance we typically see in non-romance genre stories, especially action films and adventure films and superhero films, which makes sense given that's pretty much what Avatar is. But yes, crudely speaking, it does stay pretty true to that narrative of hero meets girl, hero likes girl, hero's affections go unrequited or even unrecognized for most of the story, and then eventually hero overcomes main struggle of story and in doing so wins girl. Some fans go even further to say that Kataang caters more to the way men consume romance media, or even that it fulfills the nice guy fantasy where you insert enough nice units or I am worthy units, and eventually when you've stacked up enough points, the girl realizes that you were right for her all along. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to do the smart thing and not open that can of worms today. But I definitely think it's true that in terms of like the conflict in Kataang, it mostly boils down to, will she eventually return his feelings or won't she? Will he get the girl or not? And it doesn't tend to get much deeper or messier than that. And while you could argue that maybe it could have, and maybe even still could, it also doesn't really need to. I'll get more into that in a minute. On the other hand, the dynamic between Katara and Zuko is a lot more fluid. And I would actually argue that the fact that they have less screen time together actually makes this easier to see. With only a handful of scenes together before they become allies in late season 3, their development is a lot more striking to witness. They start off on clearly opposing sides, with fundamentally opposing goals and worldviews. Then after a while, you get the scene where they've both grown as characters from the last time they interacted together. You see them open up and empathize with each other properly for the first time, seeing each other in a different light. And then comes the huge turning point, the betrayal scene. The scene where you wonder if this is a point of no return for one or both of them. And then finally, there's the redemption and the angst and forgiveness, and it ends with them finally being united on the same goal. Throughout this entire journey, they've both changed a lot since the first time they met, and for better or worse, not all, but a lot of this change can be directly attributed to their evolving relationship with one another. Especially that opening up / betrayal / turning point scene, which I'd argue was very formative towards both their character growths in season 3. Now, can you see what I see? Forget who has better chemistry or who's more compatible or whatever. Just forget all of that for a second. These story beats, they meet. There's conflict. There's understanding. There's hope. There's betrayal. There's drama. There's that scene where you think they might never see eye to eye or ever reconcile again, except then they work through it and then ultimately come around in the end. That structure is basically textbook romance genre structure. Does that make sense? I feel like when you look at it that way, not only does it become so obvious, but it's also really easy to see why people on both sides have such strong feelings about it. Please understand, I'm not saying it's the better arc, right? That's totally subjective. But it is the arc that shows up in romance fiction all the freaking time. Stories are driven by conflict. And most people prefer internal, character-driven conflict rather than external sources of conflict. Which means when you apply this to the romance genre specifically, it makes sense why romances that feature two characters overcoming their flaws and first impressions and going on a back and forth journey where they learn to accept and empathize with and develop feelings for and eventually commit to a relationship with someone who challenges them as an individual. It makes sense why that sort of framework is so wildly popular and has withstood the test of time for hundreds of years of storytelling. It might not be realistic, it might not reflect true love goals in real life, but it is popular. And we know that the romance genre in general tends to be catered more towards a female audience, while the action, adventure, superhero genre tends to be seen as more for a male audience, or maybe, I guess, more for a general audience, but usually more male. And what do you know? According to my survey, there does seem to be a bit of a gender divide between these two shipping communities. I also find it rather telling that in all the shipping wars I've seen, it's always the Zutarians who are accused of being rabid fangirls. I never see Kataangers get accused of being a rabid fangirl or, only liking their ship purely as a result of fangirling. Is this a bear I want to poke today? Probably not the wisest idea. I'm going to leave this bear alone. Now, I know some Zutarians ship Zutara because, to put it bluntly, they're the hot couple. But for most of us, I think there's more to it than that. From a storytelling perspective, romance stories are like any other stories in that they need drama and conflict in order to function and for the ending to feel earned. Basically, if the plot of the story is all about the romance, you gotta have that drama and conflict woven into the relationship dynamic itself in order to feel interesting. You need something that exists to drive the characters apart and force them to work for their resolution. This something could either be an external force, like disapproving families or a class disparity, or it could be more internal, like fundamentally opposing values or worldviews, or even better, some combination of both, usually intertwined. On the other hand, if the romance is more of a subplot to the actual plot of the story, which is something other than romance, then you don't really need to hit these beats at all. In fact, it might even be hugely distracting and detract from the main plot if you try to build tension and drama and internal and external struggles. If you're not careful, sometimes an epic romance saga can become too dramatic and can make the rest of the story suffer. Not always, definitely not always, but it can be. Ultimately, I think that's what it really comes down to. Which one of these two equally serviceable story arcs and relationship dynamics, which one speaks to you more? Which one engages and interests you more as a viewer? Do you prefer your romance fiction to be exciting roller coaster rides where your characters' conflicting personalities drive them apart here and bring them together there? Or do you prefer your romance fiction to be steady, calm, gentle, less exciting, but full of clarity and comfort and tenderness? Do you guys want to know? Well, it shouldn't really come as that much of a surprise, but when it comes to high tension, high stakes, emotionally charged romances that force the characters to grow and change over the course of their fiery love stories, Zutarians were much more likely to enjoy those types of story arcs than Kataangers. Alternatively, it was the comforting, sweet, low drama, endearing stories of romance that appealed the most to Kataangers. Seriously, look at this spread. They're practically mirror opposites. Compared to Zutarians, Kataangers were more likely to consider high conflict romances to be a major turnoff, and of course, for Zutarians, pretty much the exact opposite was true. Cool, right? Now, I want to make it clear, again, here, that there's nothing inherently wrong or invalid about either preference. Not everyone likes spicy, dramatic love stories, and some people genuinely find it super cringy, and that's okay. On the other hand, some people genuinely do love these stories, and that's also okay. Though seriously, none of you Kataangers picked this option. I bet one of you is lying. One of you just doesn't want to share their guilty pleasures on an anonymous survey on an anonymous survey online. On an anonymous survey. You try and say that fast 5 times right now. On an anonymous survey. One of you just doesn't want to share their guilty pleasures on an anonymous survey. On an anonymous survey. On an anonymous survey. Hey. One of you just doesn't want to share their guilty pleasures on an anonymous survey. And if you're that person, you know who you are. Back to the point. Basically, Zutara and Kataang each represent two very different views on what makes a romance arc compelling. This explanation completely ignores the argument about which ship services the thematic or storytelling purposes of the narrative, which is obviously gonna, your mileage may vary on that. But I think these results still demonstrate a clear divide exists between the way the two fandoms enjoy romance in general. Aang and Katara have a relationship that is nurturing and pure and sweet, while Zuko and Katara have a relationship that is challenging and volatile and dynamic. They both have their place in classic and modern cinema. And I'll say it again, you're not wrong for persistently enjoying one category more than the other. Another thing I'll say here is that I've seen each ship accuse the other one of being cliché. Guys, stop it. You're both equally cliché, just in different ways. You see the whole guy earns girl's heart and the enemies to lovers trope all the damn time in the freaking media. I don't know about you, but I would argue that these two are pretty equally popular, just usually relegated to different genres. It really just boils down to a matter of preference. You are free to find either one of these narratives more enjoyable than the other one. I hope that this video gives you a better understanding of why you ship the pairing you do and why the other side likes the pairing that they like. The point is, everyone's entitled to their taste in romance. What I will say though is this. As much as people criticize Kataang for being rushed or forced, and to an extent, they're not completely off the mark because even the creators themselves have kind of admitted as much. But that's not as glaring a problem as it would have been, I think, if we had just had Zuko and Katara on that balcony at the end of the show, leaning in for a kiss. Because like I said earlier, the main hurdle in the Kataang relationship is more about getting both sides to realize their feelings for each other. The Kataang ship, given its structure, this is its natural endpoint, in a sense. He likes her. There's a few scenes sprinkled here and there where she sort of entertains the idea. She seems to reject him initially, and then she ultimately comes around. Whether or not you think it's been properly earned, their story of romance ends here, and it doesn't beg for any deeper exploration than that. You don't need to explore what this conclusion means for the couple. And I'm willing to bet that's a big reason why we don't see as much fan engagement with Kataang. We don't see as many fanfics or fan art made of them because there just isn't as much of a need for it. There's not a lot of questions that still need answering or like any obvious glaring potential for how this relationship could force them to grow or change or, redefine their characters in some way. Let me rephrase my earlier statement a little bit. It's not that the story has to end here, but it can easily and without causing any problems. It's tidy. On the other hand, if Zutara were ever to become a thing, no matter how much more compelling you might think their dynamic is as a couple, even if you're a die-hard shipper, I hope you can see what I mean when I say, I don't think you can just reward these two with the kiss at the end of the show like you could with Kataang and be like, yeah, that's it, we're done. You can't. Ignoring the pacing dilemma for a second, there would still be so many questions. Even if the passion is there, could this relationship actually work? Zuko is obviously going to be the Fire Lord after all this. Would Katara be ready or willing to be his Fire Lady? What kind of sacrifices would entering the world of Fire Nation aristocracy mean for her? We know that even Mai, someone who grew up in that world and is presumably used to it, found it stifling and oppressive. Would Katara be able to handle it? Could she adapt? Would she adapt? How would the Fire Nation respond? How would the Water Tribes respond? They've been natural enemies for decades. How would all of this affect their relationship with one another? How would such a relationship change their characters? Could they see it through in the end, or would they tragically have to go their separate ways, still caring for each other, but forced to accept that Katara just doesn't belong in that world or in that role, and never will, so she ends up leaving him? There's so much to explore, and for a lot of Zutarians, I think that's one of the things that makes this pairing so interesting. But regardless, it's much easier and faster and neater to give closure to Kataang than you could to Zutara. And I'm not saying this to disparage either side, I think that's just a fact. To go back to my point on fan engagement, I think Zutarians engage with their ship in terms of fan work for the same reason that Kataangers don't. Because there are just that many more questions and dilemmas to explore with this pairing. And that's probably why it's managed to retain so much popularity nearly 2 decades later. That uncertainty, that potential, there's a lot to think and wonder and speculate about. But with only a few episodes between Katara forgiving Zuko and the end of the show, I don't think an endgame kiss would have given Zutara any meaningful sort of resolution. If nothing else, there certainly wasn't enough time to explore any of those earlier questions in any real depth. A kiss would have maybe validated some people's preferences, but I'd argue that it wouldn't have been satisfying. Especially when you consider how many Zutarians ship these two because of the idea, or at least the fantasy, of a turbulent, passionate roller coaster romance. There's no way we could have gotten that in the time that we had. And even if we could have been satiated with a kiss, I still think it would have felt kind of jarring, just given the pacing of their evolving relationship dynamic thus far. Up until now, their relationship had been a super slow burn. It literally took 56 episodes for them to really become friends. So in all fairness, it probably shouldn't take 4 episodes just to get to a kiss, right? I'm not saying they can't kiss, ever. Just that it wouldn't have fit the pacing that had already been set. The pacing that we'd all been enjoying. I mean, as a Zutarian myself, I wouldn't have given up that pacing for the world. Now, does that mean Zutara was doomed from the start? Well, your mileage may vary, but for me, not necessarily. And that brings us to the final part of this analysis. Is there a way we could have given Zutarians a conclusion that felt right? Okay, so something I found out very recently, because this is something that I never used to look up. I never bothered to look up the behind the scenes drama or whatever. But apparently, quite a few people behind the making of Avatar did want Zutara to happen, and also thought that it would have been the most logical pairing, given the characters and the relationship developments that had been happening so far. Dante Basco, Zuko's voice actor, was not only a fan of it, but felt like it was the natural direction that Zuko was heading towards as a character.
I thought it was going to happen, and then it just didn't happen.
Really?
Who knows? I wasn't around for how they wrote it, but it felt like they were riding in that direction.
Yeah.
And then they just kind of went the other direction, which I understand.
Now, what's interesting is that the head writer of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aaron Ehash, whatever. But he apparently wanted Zutara to happen, at least according to a whole host of Reddit posts and Tumblr threads that I slogged through in the last few days. Unfortunately, a lot of this is now speculation because there's like deleted Tumblr posts and Tumblr accounts being referred to, and like some of this is told from an alleged ex-intern. So take all of this with a grain of salt. That's what I'm doing. But allegedly, there was quite a bit of disagreement regarding which ship, if any, ought to be endgame. Mike and Brian, the creators of Avatar, wanted Kataang from the get-go, but Aaron, who had the most creative input on Zuko's redemption arc, was apparently rooting more for Zutara. Aaron and his wife, Elizabeth, are apparently who we should thank or blame for all the scenes that gave us Zutarians the most shipping fodder. Another thing, the Southern Raiders episode was apparently originally going to feature a dynamic between Zuko and Katara that Mike and Brian asked to be toned down because it was deemed too romantic, which does make you wonder what that might have looked like. And again, more speculation, but apparently Aaron was exploring the possibility of a 4th season, and I don't know whether that means like a season after defeating Ozai or just another season of like building up to the defeat of Ozai. But apparently he hinted at the possibility of exploring how Zuko and Katara's relationship might develop and change further if they'd all had the time and inclination to develop it. Although I don't know how true any of this actually is, I still think it's interesting to discuss because I will say this. If you were going to develop Zutara canonically, like, if it was actually going to happen, I think this is the only way it really could have worked. You would need more screen time to, A, explore this relationship properly in order to do it justice, and B, not have this exploration dominate the show entirely. But, you know, like, it could have been interesting. Enemies to finding common ground, to betrayal, to reconciliation, to friendship, to something more. But Mike and Brian were apparently very keen on having just the original 3 seasons like they'd originally planned. So, you know, not a lot of room to develop that last bit. But even then, all hope may not have been lost, as there was another rumor that I found floating around. One last rumor. And that is, apparently, Aaron did want to wrap up the story with Zuko and Katara on the balcony, but not kissing though. Just talking about how things have changed and how the world had changed, and musing about what the future might hold for everyone and for them. From what I understand, it wouldn't have been like explicitly romantic, but it would have included some not so subtle hinting, like I guess through their conversation and body language and so forth, just what might happen between them if given time. And to be honest, I think that probably would have been as good as it could have gotten for us Zutarians, just given how much time we had left in season 3. But honestly, I think it would have been perfect for us. Certainly anything more explicit than that would have felt too rushed and too much, in my opinion. On the other hand, an open-ended conclusion that feels more like a new beginning, possibly, would have fit Zutara better than like a hard-earned resolution. And it would have allowed us to keep all our fantasies of all the epic struggles and dilemmas that Zuko and Katara would be sure to face if they were to head down that path together. But ultimately, you know, it didn't fit the vision that Mike and Brian had for the show, or so the story goes. So they went with the Kataang kiss instead. Am I disappointed? Obviously. I personally would have loved an ending scene like the one that Aaron supposedly envisioned. A scene that doesn't, you know, confirm or deny or even explore anything, but just gently leaves the door open. I think that would have felt incredibly natural and believable. Honestly, I feel like it would have been intriguing and heartwarming. And maybe I'm biased and, you know, this could just be me, but I also think it's kind of mature. Like, it kind of makes me think of all those Miyazaki endings that somehow manage to portray two deeply connected soulmates without ever needing to show them kiss or even just share in a distinctly romantic moment. It's like romance without romance. You can still see the love, the deep spiritual bond the characters share with one another, even when there aren't any scenes that you could explicitly describe as romantic. That doesn't change the fact that by the end of the story, their love is real and their journey isn't over. I've been recording for like an hour by this point, so I don't know if I'm still making any sense, but what I'm trying to say is, like, you don't need to show like an explicitly romantic scene between two characters in order to sow the seeds of their blossoming love together. Right? Does that make sense? In any event, I would have loved an ending like that for Zutara. That's what I'm trying to say. At least I don't see how an ending like that could possibly have backfired. Like, I mean, yeah, we may have gotten more flame wars on the internet, but like, confirming Kataang didn't really stop that anyway, so... Anyway, that's my take. I hope I haven't ruffled too many feathers with this video. Let me know if there's anything you want to see me cover on this channel, whether it's about Zutara or anything else. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please try to be respectful to one another. There's no need to bash each other for finding one ship more appealing or exciting or romantic than the other one. Besides, we all know that Zutara is the best anyway.